so that you get a feeling of the interconnection of people that came to this area as original settlers and then through their efforts sort of mixed together. To me, as I tell a lot of people that visit museums where I am a tour guide, that history is a fascinating way to give you mental exercise because a lot of history does combine like a puzzle. So here we go, and we'll go on to the next. And I've titled it because of the celebration of this building. So during this talk, I will talk about the McCornack Oil building, or McCornack building. And our overview, we do have a lot of text on the screen, so you're welcome to read it. It's really very clear, so you can see it. And we've kind of got chapters, and the first one is about seeds of mechanization. So bear with me. Remember, I'm a teacher, history minor in college, and history nerd nowadays. And here we go, first off, with early uses of petroleum. And our fascination starts with how humans would see this bubbling out of the ground and find some sort of use for it, but in a small way. Our Native Americans used petroleum or asphaltum for everything from canoes to protecting their skin and as a medicinal. And because we're going into the 1800s and they were so important as far as modernization, I'm going to go back up and say, well, what about the Industrial Revolution? And nobody has a specific date, but it should have been from like 1760 to 1820, 1830. And they feel that when these millers started working on the mills, as our grinding stone shows here, when they started taking cotton and not only having the mill and all its operation, but then mechanizing gears and belts so it would go upstairs and spin the cotton mechanically rather than a lady sitting at a spinning wheel, spinning, twisting, pumping, and spinning to get cotton on a wheel. So this, they feel, is the beginning of this mechanization. And here you are, I'm sure, at least in your history books back in early school times, you would have seen people working in these mills. And we had them first in England, and then they were here right away. All these women and children that would work up here in these areas for many hours a day. And lots of children, and I was fascinated to see that even Andrew Carnegie, back in 1848, 1850s, he was a bobbin boy. And these little boys would run around, as you can see upstairs, where all the bobbins were quickly filling up with cotton thread, and they would take them out when they're full and put back an empty one to continuously keep spinning. Here's the other big game changer in our history of the 1800s. If anybody's watched Victoria recently, you would have seen how excited she was. But first, Prince Albert was excited about the steam train that he could go and ride on in England. And here is an early English steam train. So what they're doing here is through steam, they are taking carriages, making a train go down the track. It's fascinating how quickly people took iron and created these trains, but you also had to have a steam engine. So you had to have a boiler, and you had to have somebody putting in for fuel to get the boiler hot, to get the gears to turn and the wheels to turn. I've made a little note at the bottom about air brakes by George Westinghouse. I didn't realize they had little boys who were impoverished on the top of trains, and we're talking bigger trains here in America. After the Civil War even, they would be hired to lay on the top of the train and help stop. And George Westinghouse saw this, and he was helping at his father's factory, and there was another factory. He said, there's got to be a better way. Necessity. So fortunately, by the time the train came to some of our areas, they figured it out. Early exploration and the discovery of oil. I love it, the way oil just bubbled out of the ground in various places in the world. And this is how ancient civilizations could find it and figure out something to do with it. And I'm using a Polish inventor and scientist to stress the point that not just people in America or England were working on figuring out what to do with petroleum that would be useful. And this is Ignacy Lukasiewicz. A lot of things happen simultaneously with experimentation, invention, and then the early exploration and drilling for oil. The one that's mostly accredited with this is Colonel Drake. Once again, he was not a colonel in the Army. He was given that appellation. He was sent to go out in Pennsylvania where they knew they had a lot of oil bubbling up. And Titusville was the town. They also called it Oil City. And he was the first one to drill. But speaking to someone recently, he said, well, all you had to do was pound down into where the oil was coming from. And if you hit it right, it would just spurt up. So they called that drilling for oil.
Wow.
However, that was 1859, and as you know, we knew there was a lot of agitation going on in the United States. Everything from the abolitionists and political unrest, and especially in the South, and I'm not speaking in the same way. So when the Civil War happened, of course, most everything is being concentrated on the war effort and making things for the conflict, preparing. And I'm not going to be a teacher and say, now what would you think? They were really building up north. What do you think they were doing? And who had the advantage? And of course, I'm sure all of us know the advantage that the North had in the war. And we're stressing this, men leave farms and stores to battle. I'm going to first allude to the McCornacks and those farmers out west of Elgin. So many of them signed up, and it was usually infantry. If you signed up with cavalry, unless you were already in some sort of armed service, you brought your own horse. And here's a Yankee. The people, many of the men didn't sign up. They were supposed to be 18. And so our family from west of Elgin signed up at Camp Douglas, downtown in Chicago, which, if any of you are Civil War buffs, realize that became a Confederate prison later, to compare with Andersonville in Georgia. And then Azel and Mary Gates' son, George, also signed up, and he made it through the battle till 1864, and then was killed, as I mentioned up here. And that was an older brother of John W. Gates. The exploration of oil really continued more after the Civil War, and I'm including this cute little guy. Oops. Bad. Evan's going to help animate. Anyway, this is Lynn Taliaferro Barrett, and before the Civil War, he knew there was oil south of Nacogdoches, way up in East Texas, and he tried, and like so many of these people that knew where oil probably was rich in the ground, he just couldn't keep going. So in the meantime, he joined the Confederacy, was a quartermaster, but stayed in East Texas and kept planning and thinking, and he decided that there must be a better way to drill for oil. So he developed and handmade, probably by a toolmaker, this auger. So he's the first one to use an auger and drill for oil. Down here in Nacogdoches in East Texas, not very populated. And obviously it's fascinating because he used the donkey then in 1866 to turn around. He had gone to Pennsylvania somehow, plus a geologist he used, Mr. Caro, connected him with the Brown brothers in Titusville, Pennsylvania, because they were right there where the oil was being drilled, but they had a business. And so they sort of promised Mr. Barrett a loan. But then after the war, well, what happened? There was too much oil, too much in storage. The price of oil went way down. And the Brown brothers of Titusville, Pennsylvania decided not to back Mr. Barrett. So he had to go away and give up his dream. We're going to review some pioneer farm families, but specifically it's going to be Azel and Mary Warren Gates. And I'm sure most of you know about John W. Gates' family, where they came from. And at that time it was Turner Junction, which is now West Chicago. And I also wrote down there they had sons Gilbert, George, and John Warren. And here's a little map of West Chicago, and you can see the trains were starting to come through after the Civil War. And that's quite a line, and they were trying to connect going west and going up to Galena. And apparently the Galena-Chicago route was quite popular. And those of you that live in town here recognize this home on 2nd Street. Later on, this home was built for Azel and Mary Gates by their son John. It's fascinating. The Baker family also came out this way, but we're going to have to let the History Museum fill you in on their background. They were early farmers in the St. Charles area, and we believe on the east side of the river, which is beautiful. There's beautiful bluffs up there. Discovery and invention. This is a big section, 1870 to 1900. So much was coming together, all this Industrial Revolution. And of course, there aren't a whole lot of pictures of John W. Gates, but we're trying to give you a feel of how he changed over the years. He, with other boys, would come out to St. Charles. The young men got around quite a bit, and he went to parties. And one of the famous, well-known places to come to was the Baker farm. And they would have these little socials, and there's where he met Delora Baker. And before he could really marry her, she said, "How are you going to support me?" And he said, in the meantime, he went and got a business degree at what's North Central College, and his dad helped set him up in a specific hardware store. Well, here again, he's seeing these salesmen come through talking about their exciting life and how they can go off and make sales and make money. And as a child, that's what he was always fascinated by, these salesmen heading off. There's the lady he eventually marries, Delora Baker. And at the bottom here, I'm going to take you on into the San Antonio episode that was really the high point, I would say, of Gates's life. He knows about barbed wire. This man by the name of Pete McManus would come through his store and tell him all these things and how they weren't selling barbed wire in Texas, fine in Illinois. I would like to, anyway, out in DeKalb, as most of us know, that's where they were making barbed wire. This is what people in Texas know. This is where this barbed wire mostly was coming from. And Mr. Glidden was making it, Mr. Haish, and Ike Elwood. And the three of them would get together and talk about it. And ultimately, Mr. Elwood was the one that kept going the most. Mr. Haish felt he was kind of cheated. But he was the one that John got introduced to through his mother by knowing somebody else in DeKalb. And Mr. Elwood said, okay, we'll hire you as a salesman. We need somebody down in Texas. They're not moving any of our barbed wire. So that was John's big challenge. He gets a big idea, and I guess we having a time problem here. I can't prattle on too long, but his big idea after 2 or 3 weeks in San Antonio sees a medicine man doing a show every day about tonics and things. So he said, that's my idea. I'm going to have a big show, days on end, and I'm going to put barbed wire around Military Plaza in San Antonio, get longhorns, get cowboys, and then prove to them that this barbed wire will hold longhorns. And we'll try to tell them, well, if they need medicine for the cut longhorns, they can use this medicine man's liniment. So he was successful, and he did it more than once. And at age 21, he goes back up to Illinois, out to DeKalb, and collects his money. And he was the one that proved to Texans that they needed the barbed wire. Now we're going to jump into the McCornack family. Those of you that have been here before, when we talked about Charles McCornack's background, here he is. He's the little boy to the right as you look at the screen. There's his brother Orville, who ended up being Vice President Hudson Motor Company in Detroit, and his sister Irene. And there were other children in the family. Of course, they all worked hard on the farm, went to country school, and then went to Elgin Academy before going on to a larger university. And I give you a little background on his family. And here he is up at Elgin Academy, and I'm fascinated, pardon my personal comment, Elgin Academy is still there. It was built in 1857-58. It's a beautiful big building, but the academy is modernized with other buildings around it, including an art museum. But the Historical Society, the Elgin History Museum, is in the old academy building, Old Main. And this is where so many of the children in the area, including where, I hate to bring it up, but Grapevine, Texas, we had Donald Academy, and it was set up for the same reason. Kids went to, students, scholars went to the country school, but at 15 or 16, that was all they could do. It wasn't very advanced. So they really needed, if they wanted to go on to college or university, to go on to like a prep high school, and that's what Elgin Academy, that was its purpose. So there's Charles. It's 1893. That picture was taken in 1893, and lo and behold, I will admit I was not that aware of what all the Chicago Columbian World's Exposition had. I can't believe how much they did, how much they offered in 1893, and probably the reason is they took down all but 2 of the buildings. So I'm going to scroll through a few interesting things. There's the arts building, and I chose this one because of the outfits, especially the women. So the straw hats, which we have one over here, the clothes they were wearing, the long skirts. And this is a fantastic view, just pulled, of course, off the internet, of a lookout tower from the top of Manufacturers Building, looking out over the fair. Hundreds of thousands of people came. I'm just amazed. So put that little bee in your bonnet and think about, well, if all these people got there and it was such a huge success, how did they get there? No cars. They wouldn't have ridden bicycles. That many people weren't living in downtown Chicago, so keep that in your mind. How could they get there so well? I've listed a few things that were participants. Everything from Nikola Tesla, and we're all aware of Tesla now. Buffalo Bill Cody. Well, he was not invited, but he decided to be there, so he parked his Wild West show outside of the exposition. And I'm guessing that is where John W. Gates and his met Buffalo Bill Cody, which he became friends with for life. And of course, John W. Gates always enjoyed trap shooting when he lived out in Turner Junction as a child. And of course, Wild Bill Cody had Annie Oakley, so wherever we are, we're shooting. Louis Comfort Tiffany. Everybody's familiar with Tiffany. He did a lot of watercolor paintings which were displayed, and then he had the lamps, did a lot there, and won prizes. Daimler Automobiles, you'll see on one of these slides that we have autos. These are big electric engines done by Mr. Tesla. They're huge. And here we have huge steam engines. And this is in the manufacturer's building, which is where my great-grandfather, Sam Evans, had his company, Rawson and Evans, and they won a first prize. And they had a very large exhibit, but everyone said how noisy it was inside the manufacturer's building. And here we are with a car, and these Germans were coming up with the internal combustion engine. And here we have ladies visiting the fair, and they get to sit in, maybe ride a little bit in this car. So let's put it together. We know John W. Gates is here in Chicago because he's got an office at the Rookery Building, which is next door to the Continental Illinois Bank and Trust, right downtown, good choice. Well, the fair is just down a few blocks from him. He's seeing that oil is coming in. My grandfather comes in with his family on the train to the fair so they can see all this. Besides, I'm sure they're talking about it out here in Elgin Academy. Newspapers were very all-encompassing. People really got together and read newspapers, which had the latest news. This is a zipper, didn't realize. But here again, it's almost mechanical because it takes metal. Anybody know about the dishwasher this lady invented? Can you believe? People didn't even have electricity till 1920, and she's got an electric dishwasher. And here we are, the world comes to Chicago. I'm not positive, but this looks like the old McQueen Station, 4 miles west of Elgin, where our family settled. And because the old Galena stagecoach road went from Chicago out to Galena and back, shortly after they said, let's use this road for the railroad basic path. And there's an old station, so this is not 1893 even, this is about 1920. And the station's been neglected. But there you are, you can tell it's still a steam train because you have water having to be put into the engine. So here we are back to John Warren Gates. The barbed wire is there because reminder of that's how he got his first success. And he is so peeved with Mr. Elwood because they won't take him in as a partner that he goes on and says, fine, I'll compete with you. So where he went was down in St. Louis, Missouri, so he could stay away from the law, sort of, because they did try to come after him, saying he's copied their patent. And while he's making all this money, going to England, and that's where he, as you see, gets his nickname, Bet-A-Million. He's betting on horse races. So he didn't quite win $1 million. The reporters in London kind of wrote it wrong, but he did win money, and he must have had a lot of this. This is indicative of how he had money to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. In the meantime, he has been invited to come down to Port Arthur, Texas, by a friend who's trying to set up a tourist area in that bay of the Sabine River, just inside the Gulf of Mexico. So he comes down, he's on the board, and he realizes this man's trying to get the trains down. Well, John's already got the Kansas City train coming down because this other man was working on it. The railroad has difficulties, can't make enough money, so John takes over the railroad. So that's how he gets to Port Arthur. While he's down there and back commuting to Chicago to his office in the Rookery, his agent, one of his right-hand men, gets called upon by the men who are trying to drill oil at Spindletop.